So the engine's all built. We've got it on our chassis. There's fuel to it. Got batteries hooked up. We've got a laptop hooked up. We're connecting to the ECM, and we're going to start the engine for the first time and listen to it run. It's going to sound great, and it'll be another job well done. Here we go.
Can't do the control throttle.
I don't know if you caught it there at the end, but Chuck, the guy that built the engine, said it should have lit. It didn't even make a bark, a chirp, anything. It's as if we were cranking an engine with no fuel in it. Let's take a look at some things you're going to need to know. First, the ECM has feedback loops that tell it what's going on. Up on top, you've got a fuel rail pressure control. It's important that you know how that works. So what happens is the ECM, the green arrow pointing to the actuator, that green arrow represents a pulse width signal that changes in duty cycle and then current. The voltage doesn't really change, but the current does and the duty cycle does. If you've got about 900 milliamps of current, the ECM is telling the actuator, make all the fuel pressure you can make. If you've got between 25 and 3500, depending on the engine, the ECM is saying, don't make any more fuel pressure at all. So somewhere in between there, between 900 and 2700, and duty cycle changes, that's how it controls that fuel pressure. And the rail pressure sensor, of course, tells the ECM how much fuel pressure's in the rail. It's important to know that if no current is going to the fuel pump actuator, in other words, as if you unplugged it, the fuel pump will make the maximum pressure it can possibly make. It's not going to stop making pressure. It's back against the wall, all go. Down on the bottom, we have our starting and running controls, which is camshaft sensor input, engine crankshaft or speed sensor input. In this case, on this engine, there's a tone wheel on the back of the crank, and it does have a wide spot on it. It has a wide tooth, if you will, and that's how the engine knows that number one's atop that center. The camshaft position sensor, of course, doesn't count. There's no teeth for it to count, but it has position marks, and it knows which position represents number one on the power cycle. The boost sensor lets the ECM know how much basically oxygen or pressurized or fresh air is in the cylinder, so that the ECM doesn't put in too much fuel or not enough fuel to make the appropriate power and help it to run with the right mixture. And the last diagram I want you to look at here is things you need to know, and keep these in mind while you're going through figuring out what's going on. The lift pump runs 20 to 30 seconds at key on, and then it does not run again until a 30-second key off to reset the ECM start sequence. And the lift pump is a pulse width circuit, and it runs at a specific duty cycle that can change a little bit, but pretty steady at the voltage level of whatever the ECM is being fed at, whether it's 12 volts or 24 volts. So lift pumps are voltage specific. Second, the ECM must see crank cam movement from the engine to change from the stop state to the crank state. I'm going to talk about that in my next video. Fuel pressure is controlled by a feedback circuit. You just learned that. The fuel rail has an overpressure fuel pressure dump on it. That valve gets hot to the touch when it's opening and letting excessive fuel pressure out of the rail. The turbocharger fuel control state goes active when the ECM is commanding a high amount of fuel in the cylinders to make power to maintain RPM under load, but there is not enough boost to burn all that fuel. Too much fuel and not enough air makes for an extremely hot exhaust that can over time damage the turbocharger or the exhaust system, the manifold and the turbine housing on the turbo. So turbocharger fuel control is a protection mode to protect the turbo from being cooked from too much fuel, not enough air. If we don't go into crank state, the engine will never start. Maximum fueling means the ECM is commanding full power fueling to the injectors. I want you to remember all of these and refer back to them as you go through the different data logs and things. Okay, that's the intro for this first segment. The next segment, I'm going to talk about the engine operating states because you need to understand a little bit about that. And then after that, we'll be starting to put up information for you to look at so that you can help us to figure out what happened. See you next time on Engine Shop Joe.